The job posting online had been short, vague, and exactly what I needed. Fire lookout remote location, solo occupancy, long season, isolation required. It didn't list the pay, or the exact location, or the duties beyond the basics. It just said, if you want to be left alone, apply. At 29 years old, fresh out of a relationship that had fallen apart, and tired of the noise and speed of city life in Minneapolis, that line called to me louder than anything else. I didn't want to talk to people. I didn't want to explain why I was quiet or why I looked tired. I just wanted space. I wanted air that didn't smell like exhaust. I wanted silence. 2 weeks later, I was driving north, deeper and deeper into Superior National Forest, until the paved roads turned to gravel, and gravel turned to dirt. And finally, dirt turned into nothing but rutted tracks, barely wide enough for my truck. The forest here is old, ancient, really. These woods don't feel like they belong to the modern world. They stand tall and thick, rows of red pine and balsam fir, packing the hillsides so tight you can't see more than a few feet into them. The canopy above was so dense, it felt like driving through a green tunnel that never ended. My drop-off point was at the base of a steep ridge. A park ranger named Elias, an older man with a face weathered like cracked leather and eyes that looked like they had seen too much, met me there. He helped me unload my supplies, enough canned food, water, kerosene, and gear to last me 4 months. We didn't talk much while we worked. He moved slowly, methodically, and kept glancing up toward the peak where my new home sat waiting. When everything was stacked, he leaned against the tailgate and handed me a folded sheet of yellowed paper. It looked like it had been passed from hand to hand for decades, the edges worn thin. "Logbooks are inside," Elias said, his voice low and rough. "Radio checks at 8 a.m. and 8 p.m. sharp. If you miss one, they send a team. But you don't want them coming up here unless absolutely necessary." I frowned, turning the paper over. "Why not? Is the trail hard?" He looked at me then, straight in the eyes, and I felt a chill run down my spine that had nothing to do with the cool breeze coming off the treetops. "The trail is fine. The forest is different up high. It's older, quieter." He nodded at the paper in my hand. "Read these. Memorize them. Don't just follow them because they're rules. Follow them because they keep you breathing. Every lookout before you wrote their own version. But these are the ones that never change." Before I could ask what he meant, he climbed back into his truck. He started the engine, but paused before shifting gears. "One last thing, Leonard. You said you wanted to be alone. Up there, you have to work at it, because something is always watching. You just have to make sure they don't think you're worth paying attention to." And with that, he drove away, kicking up a cloud of dust that quickly settled back onto the road. Within a minute, the sound of his engine vanished, swallowed instantly by the trees. The silence that rushed in to fill the space was heavy. It pressed against my ears, thick and palpable. I stood there for a moment, alone with 50 pounds of gear and a list of rules written on old paper, wondering what exactly I had signed up for. The climb took me nearly 3 hours. The trail was steep, winding through rock outcroppings and roots that twisted like exposed veins in the earth. As I ascended, the character of the woods changed. The trees grew taller, straighter. They seemed to reach higher toward the sky, their trunks thicker, their bark rougher and darker. There was no underbrush here, no bushes or small plants, just endless columns of wood rising from a carpet of dead needles, spaced perfectly apart like soldiers standing at attention. When I finally broke through the tree line onto the rocky summit, I stopped to catch my breath and looked up. The tower stood there, a square cabin built on tall wooden stilts, painted a faded red, standing roughly 40 feet high. It commanded a view that went on forever. To the east, I could see the blue shine of a distant lake. To the west, ridge after ridge rolled away like green waves in a storm. It was beautiful, breathtakingly so. The wind felt clean here, sharp and cold. I felt lighter already, as if the weight of the past year had fallen off my shoulders halfway up the trail. I dragged my gear up the rickety wooden stairs, the whole structure creaking and swaying gently with my steps. The door was unlocked, just as Elias had said it would be. Inside was sparse but functional. A wood stove, a small table, a bunk bed with a thin mattress, a chair by the wide windows that ran all around the room. In the corner sat the Osborne fire finder, a heavy metal device used to triangulate smoke locations, and next to it, the logbook. I dropped my pack on the floor and sat down in the chair. The view from up here was everything I had dreamed of. Miles and miles of untouched land, no cities, no traffic, no people, just me and the sky and the endless sea of trees. I remembered the paper in my pocket and pulled it out. I unfolded it carefully and smoothed it onto the table. There were 7 rules written in neat, slanted handwriting. At the top, in bold capital letters. Operational Guidelines. Lookout Station 14. Effective Season 19, 54 to present. Count the trees visible from the north deck every morning at sunrise. Record the number. If the count is higher than yesterday's, do not mention it in the log. Do not look at them for more than 10 seconds. Never shine your light downward or outward after dark. Keep all illumination pointed strictly inward or toward the sky. Light draws attention. Attention leads to visits. If you hear voices calling your name, or familiar sounds such as a baby crying, music, or footsteps, ignore them completely. Do not reply. Do not investigate. The forest mimics what it knows you want to hear. At midnight, turn off all lamps and remain perfectly silent and motionless for 10 minutes. This is their time of movement. If you are still, you are part of the scenery. If you move, you are prey. Do not mark the map with every new feature. Some landmarks are temporary. Some landmarks are moving. Trust only the major peaks and the lakes. Everything else shifts. If fog settles in thick enough that you cannot see the ground below the tower, lock the door. Barricade it. Fog is not weather. Fog is a curtain. Remember, you do not watch over the forest. You watch for the forest. There is a difference. I read them through twice, then laughed softly to myself. It sounded like the ramblings of a man who had spent too many months alone up here. Cabin fever. That's all it was. Isolation does strange things to the mind. Makes you see things and hear things that aren't there. Elias had probably been messing with me, passing down the silly traditions of the job to every new guy, just to see who took it seriously. I folded the paper up and tucked it into the cover of the logbook, deciding I'd keep it as a joke. I was here for the quiet, not to play games. The first week passed peacefully. I settled into a routine. Wake up, make coffee, scan the horizon for smoke, write my reports, read books, watch the sun move across the sky. It was simple. It was perfect. The trees were beautiful. The air was crisp, and I felt more at peace than I had in years. I even started counting the trees from the north deck just to keep myself occupied, though I never wrote the number down anywhere. I estimated roughly 400 tall pines stood at the edge of the clearing surrounding the tower. I liked watching them sway in the wind. They looked like any other trees. Tall, ancient, rooted deep in the earth. On the 8th morning, I woke up early, before the sun, pulled on my jacket, and stepped out onto the wooden deck. The air was freezing, biting at my exposed skin. The sky was turning a pale gray pink in the east. I leaned against the railing, coffee mug in hand, and began my usual count, just to pass the time. 390, 391. I stopped. I frowned and started again, counting slower, pointing my finger at each dark shape against the lighter background of the ridge. 412, 413. My heart gave a strange, uncomfortable thump. Yesterday, there had been roughly 400. I knew that because I'd counted them yesterday too. Today, there were 437. I scanned the tree line, looking for saplings, looking for places where the canopy had closed in or I had miscounted before. But these weren't small trees. These were mature pines, tall and thick, standing right at the edge of the clearing, closer than the others. They hadn't been there yesterday. I was sure of it. I would have seen them. They were big enough to cast shadows across the dirt path I walked every day. I remembered the first rule. If the count is higher than yesterday's, do not mention it. Do not look at them for long. I forced myself to turn away, sipping my coffee even though my mouth had gone dry. It's perspective, I told myself. The angle of the sun is different today. The mist is playing tricks with my eyes. I'm tired. I need more sleep. But as I went back inside to write my log entry, my hand hovered over the paper. I wrote, "Visibility excellent. No smoke. Unchanged conditions." I didn't mention the trees. That night, the wind picked up. It howled around the stilts of the tower, making the whole cabin groan and vibrate, the wood rubbing against wood with a high-pitched screech that sounded eerily like a voice crying out. I sat by the stove, reading a book, trying to ignore the noise. Around 10 o'clock, the wind died down completely. The silence that followed was absolute, heavy, pressing. And then I heard it. Crunch. A single footstep on dry needles, right below the floorboards where my feet rested. My head snapped up. I stared down at the floor. Crunch. Crunch. Slow, deliberate steps, circling the base of the tower. Whatever it was heavy. It wasn't a deer or a fox. It sounded like something much larger, walking upright, stepping carefully around the supports. I stood up slowly, moving to the window, careful not to make a sound. I peered down into the darkness. The moon was hidden behind clouds, and the woods below were nothing but a black void. I couldn't see anything, but I could hear it clearly. It was walking the perimeter of the clearing, going round and round the tower. Then, a voice drifted up from the darkness, soft and clear. "Leonard, Are you up there? My blood turned to ice. It was my sister's voice. Sarah's voice. She was calling my name, just like she used to do when we were kids, playing hide and seek in our backyard. Leonard, I brought you some food. Come down. It's cold out here. I gripped the windowsill so hard my knuckles turned white. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. Sarah lived 300 miles away, in Chicago. She hadn't spoken to me in 6 months after a fight we'd had. There was no way she was here. No way she could be here. Rule number 3 screamed in my memory. If you hear voices, ignore them completely. Do not reply. Do not investigate. I backed away from the window, step by step, until I hit the far wall. I clamped my hands over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut. But the voice only got louder, sweeter, more urgent. It changed then, shifting pitch, sounding like Elias, sounding like my father, sounding like every person I had ever known or missed. Leonard, come out. We miss you. Don't hide up there alone. It went on like that for hours. Walking, talking, pleading, crying. Sometimes it sounded like a crowd of people down there. Sometimes it sounded like just one person. I didn't sleep that night. I sat huddled in the corner, staring at the clock, waiting for midnight. When the hands finally clicked to 12 o'clock, I remembered rule number 4. Turn off all lamps. Remain silent. I blew out the kerosene lamp instantly. The darkness swallowed the room whole. I stopped breathing, froze in place, hardly daring to blink. Outside, the voices stopped instantly. The footsteps stopped. The wind stopped. And then something new happened. From out in the trees, from all directions at once, came a sound I will never forget. It wasn't a voice. It wasn't an animal. It was the sound of wood moving against wood. A deep, groaning, creaking sound, like giant trees being bent in a storm, but rhythmic. Creak. Snap. Creak. Snap. It sounded exactly like footsteps. Heavy, wooden footsteps moving across the forest floor, coming closer to the clearing. Through the glass of the window, in the faint starlight, I saw them. Tall, dark shapes moving between the trunks of the stationary trees. They were the same height and width as the pines, straight and slender, but they were walking. They stepped over roots and rocks with slow, jerky movements, their branches swaying not in the wind, but as arms would sway when walking. They moved silently, gliding closer to the tower, surrounding it, blocking out the little light there was. I counted them in the dark. There were dozens, and I realized with a jolt of pure terror. These were the new trees I had seen that morning. They hadn't grown there. They had walked there. They stood just at the edge of the clearing, tall and motionless, towering over the stilts, looking up at my windows. I felt their gaze. It was a physical weight, pressing down on me, cold and ancient and hungry. I stayed frozen for 10 agonizing minutes. Every instinct in my body screamed to run, to scream, to do something. But I remembered Elias's eyes. I remembered the paper. If you are still, you are part of the scenery. At exactly 12:10, the groaning sound started again, receding this time. The tall shapes turned slowly, pivoting on root feet, and walked back into the deeper darkness of the forest, merging perfectly with the real trees until I couldn't tell them apart anymore. Silence returned. But it wasn't empty silence anymore. It was a silence full of secrets. I sank down onto the floor, shaking uncontrollably. I looked over at the logbook where the yellow paper lay. I wasn't laughing at it anymore. I had come here to escape the world. I had come here to be alone. But looking out at the endless shifting wall of trees surrounding my tower, I realized the terrifying truth. I wasn't alone at all, and the things keeping me company were only getting closer, one step at a time. I didn't sleep for the rest of that night. I sat on the floor, back pressed against the cold metal stove, eyes fixed on the tree line, even though I knew better than to look too closely. Every time the wind rustled the branches, every time a dry needle fell and hit the roof, my body jerked in response, muscles coiled tight like a spring ready to snap. My mind replayed what I had seen, the tall, dark shape stepping through the darkness, the creak of wood that sounded like joints grinding, the way they had stood and watched me, patient and silent. They were trees, but they weren't. As the first gray light of dawn began to bleed over the eastern horizon, the tension in my chest loosened just a fraction. Daylight had always meant safety. It meant visibility. It meant logic. But looking out the window now, as the sun painted the tops of the pines gold, I realized how stupid that assumption was. Light only showed me what they allowed me to see. The truth was hidden in plain sight, blended perfectly into the forest I thought I knew. When the sun cleared the ridge, I forced myself to go out onto the north deck. I had to know. I had to confirm I wasn't losing my mind completely. I gripped the wooden railing until my fingers ached and began to count again, slowly, carefully, marking each distinct silhouette. 471, 472. My stomach dropped. There were almost 40 more than yesterday morning. They stood right at the edge of the clearing, their trunks straight and thick, bark dark and rough just like the ancient pines that had stood here for centuries. But I knew which ones were new. I knew because the spacing was wrong. The original trees grew with a natural randomness, gaps here, clusters there. These new ones were perfectly spaced, straight lines, marching inward, shrinking the open ground around the tower. They were closer now, 20 feet closer than the day before. Rule number 1 echoed in my head. Do not mention it in the log. Do not look at them for long. I turned away quickly, stepping back inside, and slammed the door shut, as if that thin layer of wood and glass could actually protect me. I opened the logbook, pen hovering over the page. I wanted to write it all down. I wanted to scream it into the radio when I checked in at 8. But I remembered Elias's warning. You don't want them coming up here unless absolutely necessary. And worse, what if these things could read? What if the forest listened, not just with ears, but with the wind, with the shadows, with every surface that held a mark? I wrote the lie again. Conditions unchanged, visibility good, no smoke detected. I spent the morning pacing the floor, trying to make sense of the rules Elias had left me. I spread the yellowed paper out on the table and studied it like a map to survival. I realized something then. These weren't just guidelines for behavior. They were descriptions of how the things out there operated. Rule 2. Never shine your light downward or outward after dark. Light wasn't illumination to them. It was a signal. It was a flare gun in a dark room. If I lit the lamp and looked out, I wasn't seeing them, they were seeing me. I was a bright, glowing box, sitting 40 feet up in the air, a beacon in a sea of black. No wonder they gathered around. No wonder they watched. I was the only thing that wasn't supposed to be here. Rule 3. They mimic what you want to hear. That voice last night, my sister's voice, had been so perfect, so convincing. It had known exactly what buttons to push. It knew I missed her. It knew I regretted leaving things unresolved. The forest fed on memory. It learned you by listening to your own mind. And Rule 4. Rule 4 was the most terrifying of all. Midnight is their time of movement. I had thought the tower was safe because it was high up, because it was built away from the ground. But last night proved distance meant nothing to them. They could cross the clearing in minutes. If I broke that silence, if I moved, if I made a sound, the pause they held would end. They would rush the tower. Around noon, hunger finally drove me to stop thinking and start moving. I heated up a can of stew on the stove, the smell of beef and potatoes filling the small room. It felt almost normal, domestic. For a few minutes I could pretend I was just a guy working a seasonal job, enjoying the view, worrying about nothing more exciting than rain clouds or a stray campfire. Then I looked at the map tacked to the wall. I'd marked a few landmarks the first week, rock formations, creek beds, distinct burnt patches from old fires. Now, squinting at it, I noticed something strange. The large boulder field I had noted half a mile west. It wasn't there anymore. Or rather, it wasn't where I had marked it. From my window, I could see those gray, jagged rocks sitting prominently on the ridge to the northwest. My breath hitched. Rule 5. Some landmarks are temporary. Some landmarks are moving. It wasn't just the trees. The land itself was shifting. The forest wasn't just alive. It was rearranging itself, slowly, methodically, like a predator adjusting its position before the final pounce. I wasn't guarding a static piece of land. I was standing inside a living, breathing maze that changed every time I blinked. The afternoon dragged on, slow and heavy. Clouds began to gather from the west, dark and low, rolling over the treetops like a blanket. The wind picked up again, but this time it didn't sound like wind. It sounded like whispering. Thousands of tiny voices, overlapping, murmuring words I couldn't quite catch, just at the edge of hearing. By late afternoon, the clouds had thickened enough to block out the sun completely. The light turned flat and gray, casting no shadows. And then it came. Fog. It didn't drift in softly, or rise from the ground like normal mist. It poured over the ridge like water released from a dam. Thick, white, and heavy, swallowing the trees instantly. It moved fast, racing toward the tower, erasing the world mile by mile. Rule 6 hit me like a punch to the chest. If fog settles in thick enough that you cannot see the ground, lock the door. Barricade it. I didn't hesitate. I ran to the door, threw the deadbolt, and shoved the heavy wooden chair under the handle. I pulled the curtains closed over the windows, blocking out the view, sealing myself inside a small, dim box. The temperature dropped sharply. The air turned damp and cold, smelling of wet bark, ancient earth, and something else. Something metallic, like old copper or dried blood. I sat on the bunk, knees pulled to my chest, listening. Outside, the noise changed completely. The rustling stopped. The wind died. The whispering grew louder, clearer. And then, footsteps. But these weren't the heavy, wooden steps of the walking trees. These were different, lighter, quicker, soft, wet sounds, like bare feet slapping on mud. There were dozens of them, hundreds. They surrounded the tower instantly, moving in circles, pacing, stopping right beneath my floorboards. I heard fingers drag slowly down the wooden stilts below. Screech! Screech! Long, slow scratches that made my teeth ache. Something tapped rhythmically on the outer wall. Tap, 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 directly behind my head. And voices. Not just one or two. A chorus. Leonard, come play. It's safe now. We know you're lonely. Open up. They weren't mimicking specific people anymore. They sounded like children now, high and sweet, giggling and pleading. I pressed my hands hard over my ears, squeezing my eyes shut, trying to remember what Elias had said. Fog is not weather. Fog is a curtain. A curtain for what? I thought, trembling. For things that can't stand the light? Or things that only move when hidden? They stayed for hours. I lost track of time, huddled in the dark, counting my own heartbeats just to have something real to focus on. I thought about breaking rule too, lighting the lamp, shining it out the window, scaring them off. But I knew better now. Light was a challenge. It was an invitation. If I showed myself, the scratching would turn to breaking. The tapping would turn to tearing. Around 10 at night, the fog began to lift as suddenly as it had arrived. It shredded into thin ribbons and vanished back into the trees, revealing the black shapes of the forest again. The footsteps faded away. The giggling stopped. But I didn't move. I stayed exactly where I was until the clock clicked over to midnight. Turn off all lamps. Remain silent. I blew out the small candle I had lit, plunging the room into absolute darkness. I held my breath. I expected the walking trees again. I expected the groaning and creaking of wood on wood. But tonight was different. Tonight, the sound came from above, from the roof. Thump. Something heavy landed on the wooden planks directly over my head. The whole tower shuddered under the weight. Thump. Drag. Thump. It walked across the roof. It was big, heavy enough that I could feel the vibration through the beams, through the walls, through the floorboards under me. I heard claws or roots or long fingers digging into the wood, searching for purchase, searching for a gap. Then, a face appeared in the small gap between the curtain and the window frame. I saw it clearly in the faint starlight reflecting off the glass. It was tall and thin, shaped almost like a man, but made entirely of twisted branches and rough bark. It had no eyes, just deep, hollow indentations that seemed to suck the light out of the room. Where its mouth should have been, its branches twisted and writhed, forming shapes that looked almost like letters, almost like words, but never quite forming anything readable. It pressed its face close to the glass. I felt its breath, cold, damp, smelling of rot, on the pane. It didn't speak. It didn't make a sound. It just looked. And I realized then, with a clarity that terrified me more than anything else, these things weren't mindless monsters. They were curious. They were patient. And they were learning. They were testing me. testing the rules, seeing how close they could get before I snapped, before I broke, before I made a mistake. It stayed there for the full 10 minutes. I didn't move, I didn't blink, I didn't even breathe. My heart hammered so hard I was sure it could hear it, sure the rhythm of my pulse was loud enough to give me away. At 12:10 exactly, the creature pulled back. I heard it move to the edge of the roof, pause, and then drop silently to the ground. The groaning sound started up again from all around, the trees moving, shifting, resettling their positions for the coming day. When silence finally returned, I slumped forward, gasping for air, sweat soaking my shirt. I looked around the small cabin, at the logs, the stove, the supplies I had brought, thinking I would be here for months. I wasn't guarding a forest. I was a prisoner in a cage made of wood and silence. And the bars were getting closer every single night. I looked at Rule 7 again, the last one, the one I had dismissed as poetic nonsense earlier. Remember, you do not watch over the forest. You watch for the forest. There is a difference. I finally understood what it meant. I wasn't here to spot fires. I wasn't here to protect the land. I was here to be the alarm system. I was the lookout for them. To make sure they stayed inside their boundaries. To make sure no one else came up here and disturbed them. And I also understood the most horrifying part of all. The rules didn't exist to keep me safe. They existed to keep them from coming inside. By the third week, I had stopped counting the trees. I knew exactly what the number would be. Every sunrise, the line of them was closer, the clearing shrinking by yards, not feet. The open space that had been nearly 200 yards wide when I arrived was now barely 50. They stood packed tight around the perimeter, tall and straight, their branches interlocking high above to form a canopy that blocked out half the sky. The sun struggled to get through, casting the whole summit in a strange, perpetual twilight, green and dim. The tower felt less like a vantage point now, and more like a stake driven into the center of a trap. I had also stopped trying to make sense of the map. The geography of Superior National Forest had dissolved into something fluid and unpredictable. Streams changed course overnight. Ridges moved. Valleys appeared where I knew flat ground had been. I had seen a small lake vanish completely one afternoon, replaced by a grove of young birches that hadn't been there the morning before. The only things that stayed in their proper place were the major lakes and the highest peaks, just as Rule 5 had warned. Everything else was a lie, a shifting illusion designed to disorient and contain me. My supplies were holding out, but the isolation was eating at me faster than hunger or cold. I found myself talking to the stove, to the logbook, to the empty air, just to hear a human voice. But I always stopped quickly, remembering rule number 3. Sound draws them. Every word I spoke was like a beacon, every breath a signal. I learned to move silently, gliding across the floorboards without a creak, opening cans without a clatter, breathing through my nose so softly even I could barely hear it. I was becoming less of a man and more of a shadow myself. My routine had changed too. I no longer read or listened to the radio or moved around the cabin freely. I spent my days sitting by the window, watching, waiting, studying the patterns of the things outside. I had learned their rhythms. I knew when the whispers would start, usually around dusk, rising from the undergrowth like steam. I knew when the fog would roll in, heavy and white, hiding their movements. I knew when the heavy groan of wood grinding on wood would shake the ground, marking their slow migration inward. And I learned the most important lesson of all. The rules weren't suggestions. They were a contract. As long as I held up my end, as long as I stayed still, stayed quiet, kept the light inside, they held back. They tested the boundaries, yes. They pressed close. They mimicked voices and scratched at the walls and walked across the roof. But they never crossed that invisible line I had unknowingly agreed to. They were bound by their own laws, ancient and unbreakable, just as I was bound by mine. Until the night the storm came. It started just after sunset, a black mass of clouds rolling in faster than any weather system I had ever seen. It didn't drift. It charged. The wind rose to a scream, bending the pines almost double, tearing branches off and hurling them through the air. Thunder cracked directly overhead, loud enough to rattle the glass in the frames and make the whole structure sway, followed instantly by a flash of lightning that turned the world blinding white for a second. And in that second of pure, harsh light, I saw everything. I saw that the forest didn't end at the edge of the clearing. It went on forever, mile after mile, filled with the same walking shapes, all standing perfectly still, all facing inward toward my tower. I saw that the trees I had thought were ancient and rooted were actually hollow, their trunks twisted and gnarled like bundles of thick rope, their roots lifting and placing with every step. I saw faces in the bark, thousands of faces, frozen in expressions of terror or longing, trapped in the wood, watching me with eyes that were knots and holes. I realized then with a sickening lurch of my stomach, these weren't just creatures. These were people. People who had come here before me, who had broken the rules, who had been absorbed, transformed, added to the endless ranks of the Guardians. The lightning faded, and darkness slammed back down, heavier than before. The image remained burned into my retinas. I wasn't surrounded by monsters. I was surrounded by the ghosts of every man who had ever tried to escape this place, turned into the very thing they feared. Then came the rain. Not drops, but sheets of water, hammering against the roof and walls, drumming so loud I could barely hear myself think. The temperature plummeted. Within minutes, the rain turned to sleet, then to heavy, wet snow, even though it was the middle of summer. It was unnatural weather, violent and forced, summoned by something that didn't care about seasons or logic. I checked the clock. 11:48 p.m. 12 minutes until midnight. 12 minutes until their time. I moved to the center of the room, away from the windows, instinctively preparing for the ritual of silence I had performed every night for weeks. But the storm was loud, deafening. The wind howled, the snow hissed, the wood of the tower groaned and protested under the assault. It was the loudest it had ever been. I looked at the kerosene lamp on the table. I had kept it low all evening, following Rule 2. But now, the darkness outside was absolute. The snow swirled so thick I couldn't see 3 feet past the railing. The noise was so great that the usual sounds of their movement, the creaks, the whispers, the footsteps, were completely drowned out. Light draws attention, the rule said. Attention leads to visits. But what if the storm was loud enough to cover the light? What if the noise outside was so great they couldn't hear me, couldn't feel me? What if the chaos masked my presence? Stupidity, arrogance, curiosity. The same things that had brought me up this mountain in the first place. I wanted to see. I wanted proof. I wanted to know exactly how close they were right now, hidden behind the white curtain of snow. I needed to know if I was still safe, or if the circle had closed completely while I wasn't looking. I told myself it would be just for a second, just a glance. I reached out and turned the wick up high. Bright, golden light flooded the room, shooting out through every window, casting a wide, brilliant circle onto the snow and trees below. It cut through the falling flakes like a searchlight, illuminating everything within 30 yards. For a few seconds, I saw nothing but white swirls and dark trunks. I leaned closer to the glass, squinting, trying to pierce the blizzard, waiting for my eyes to adjust. And then the wind died, instantly, completely, as if someone had flipped a switch. The snow stopped falling straight down and hung suspended in the air, glittering in my light like thousands of tiny diamonds. The silence that fell was heavier than anything I had ever experienced. It crushed against my ears, painful and absolute. The sudden absence of noise was worse than the roar of the storm. It felt like the whole world had stopped breathing, and from out of the white, they stepped forward. They had been waiting right at the base of the tower. I hadn't realized how close they had gotten. They were touching the stilts now, their rough bark pressing against the painted wood. Dozens of them. Hundreds. They turned their heads, long, branchy necks creaking, and looked straight up at me. My light hadn't hidden me. It had illuminated me perfectly. I was like an insect pinned under a microscope slide, glowing bright and warm in a cold, dark world. I looked at the clock. 12 a.m. Midnight. Turn off all lamps. Remain silent. My hand flew to the lamp, shaking so hard I almost knocked it over. I twisted the wick down, blew out the flame, and plunged the room back into darkness. My heart hammered against my ribs, fast and frantic. It's okay, I told myself. I turned it off fast enough. I didn't move. I stayed still. It's okay. But it was too late. The signal had been sent. The invitation had been accepted. The rules had been tested, and I had failed. From below, a sound rose up. Not a groan, not a creak, but a roar. A sound like a whole forest being uprooted at once, deep and resonant, vibrating through the floorboards and up my legs. The ground shook violently. The entire tower swayed sideways, tipping dangerously, and I fell to the floor, scrambling backward toward the center of the room, hands sliding across the rough wood. I heard them climbing. They didn't use the stairs. They didn't need doors or windows. Long, thick roots and branches wrapped around the wooden legs of the tower, coiling upward like snakes, tightening, crushing the timber under immense pressure. I heard beams splintering with sharp cracks. Nails popped out of their holes with loud pings in the dark. The whole structure groaned, protesting the weight of the forest pulling itself upward toward me. Something smashed against the window to my left. The glass spiderwebbed but held, holding together just barely. Then another hit, harder this time, right in the center. I saw branches pushing through the cracks, wriggling like fingers, searching for space, searching for heat, searching for me. Rule 4. If you are still, you are part of the scenery. If you move, you are prey. I froze. I stopped breathing. I pressed myself flat against the floorboards, arms tight to my sides, eyes wide open even though there was nothing to see but shadows. I forced my muscles to lock, my limbs to become dead weight. I tried to make my mind go blank, to think of nothing, to be nothing more than an object lying on the floor. The tower groaned, leaning dangerously now. I could feel the weight of them pressing against every side. They were all around, above, below, inside the walls. The scent of rot and damp earth filled the air, choking me, thick and heavy. It smelled like ancient things, things that had been dead for centuries but were still moving. Voices rose up, thousands of them, all speaking at once, no longer mimicking, no longer pretending to be people I knew. Now they spoke with one voice, deep and rustling, like wind through a million leaves. Stay. Stay. Stay with us. Join the watch. You belong here. You are one of us now. Wait. Watch. Grow. The window beside me shattered inward completely. Cold wind and snow and sharp wooden shards exploded into the room, scattering across the table and bunk. A massive shape filled the frame, towering over me, blocking out what little starlight remained. I felt its presence more than I saw it. Ancient, powerful, endless, radiating a cold that went deeper than temperature. It reached down, long twig fingers brushing the floor inches from my face. I felt the rough texture of bark graze my cheek. It searched for heat. It searched for movement. It searched for life. I didn't move a muscle. My heart hammered so hard I thought it would burst, but I forced my body to remain perfectly still. I bit the inside of my cheek until I tasted blood, using the pain to keep my focus, to stop myself from screaming or scrambling away. It leaned closer. I felt its breath ruffle my hair, cold, smelling of moss and rain and time. It waited. It listened. It knew I was here. It just needed me to make one mistake. One sound. One twitch. One breath that wasn't perfectly timed with the wind. Seconds stretched into minutes. The whole world held its breath. The tower creaked, suspended in the balance between falling and standing. Then, slowly, agonizingly slowly, the creature pulled back. The branches retreated from the window. The crushing pressure around the tower loosened. The swaying stopped. The roar died down, fading back into that low, rhythmic groan. They were leaving. Not because they were scared, not because they were defeated, but because they had decided I had learned my lesson. I had broken the rule, yes. I had shown the light. But I had repented. I had gone still. I had submitted. It was a warning. A severe, terrifying warning. I lay there on the freezing floor for hours after they were gone, shivering uncontrollably, staring at the broken window where snow drifted in and piled on the sill. I was covered in dust and splinters, my muscles aching from the tension, my mind completely shattered. I realized then that survival wasn't about strength or intelligence or courage. It was about obedience. It was about understanding that they were the masters here, and I was just a guest allowed to exist as long as I followed the law. When the sun finally rose, painting the devastation in pale morning light, I got up slowly, every joint stiff and sore, and looked outside. The clearing was gone, completely gone. The trees now stood right up against the base of the tower, their trunks touching the stilts, surrounding me on all sides, pressing close enough that I could have reached out and touched them from the deck. There was no open ground left. They had closed the circle completely during the storm. I was now standing literally inside the forest, 40 feet above the ground, encased in a cage of living wood, buried alive in the open air. I looked down at the yellowed paper on the table, the rules that had saved my life, spread out where I had left them. I understood everything now. I hadn't come here to escape. I had come here to be planted, just like them. Elias knew it. Every ranger knew it. The job wasn't a job. It was a recruitment, or unter a prison sentence. I walked to the logbook and opened it to a fresh page. My hands were steady now. The fear had been replaced by a cold, heavy acceptance. I didn't write about visibility or smoke or weather. I wrote the rules again, exactly as they were, in my own handwriting, so the next person would know. So the next person wouldn't make the same mistakes I almost made. Operational Guidelines. Lookout Station 14. Count the trees every morning. If there are more, you are being enclosed. Do not complain. Keep your light low. You are a secret, not a lighthouse. Do not answer the voices. They only call you because they miss what they used to be. Midnight is their time. Be still. Be nothing. Do not trust the land. It changes to keep you in. Fog is a curtain. When it falls, do not look behind it. You are not the guardian. You are the crop. I packed nothing. There was nowhere left to go. The trail I had climbed up weeks ago was gone, buried under roots and new growth. The map was useless. The outside world was a memory that faded further with every breath I took. If I tried to walk down now, I would be swallowed instantly, added to the ranks, my face frozen forever in the bark of a pine. I sat down in the chair by the window, the same chair I had sat in when I first arrived, full of hope and a desire for solitude. I looked out at the endless, silent ranks of trees standing guard around me, stretching as far as the eye could see in every direction. They were close enough now that I could see the texture of their bark in detail, close enough that I could almost touch them through the broken glass. Days turned into weeks. Weeks turned into months. The radio went silent one day, and I didn't bother fixing it. The food ran low, and I learned to eat what I could find growing on the deck. Small berries and moss that tasted like nothing but kept me alive. My hair grew long, my beard grew thick. My skin turned pale and gray, taking on the tone of the wood around me. I became very good at being quiet, very good at being still. At night, when they moved, I didn't fear them anymore. I watched them. I understood them. We were the same now, bound by the same rules, living the same endless, patient life. I realized then that I had gotten exactly what I asked for. I wanted to be alone. I wanted to disappear from the world. I wanted peace and silence and distance from everything I had ever known. And I had. No one comes here. No one remembers me. I am gone from the records, gone from the roads, gone from the minds of the people I left behind. I exist only here, in this tower, in this moment, forever watching. Every night they move a little closer. Every night the circle tightens just a fraction more. One day they will reach the tower. One day they will press against the walls, and the wood will fuse with the wood, and I will become part of the structure itself, looking out forever from the grain of the timber, another face in the bark waiting for the next lookout. Until then, I do my duty. I keep the light low. I stay silent. I watch. I guard a tower deep in the woods. The trees move closer every night.